Hello, my name is Daniel Marshall, 35 years old. I live in Seattle, Washington, in a small apartment on the 8th floor of an old building where the smell of fresh baked bread from the bakery down the street drifts through my window every morning. I'm an education consultant, a job that sounds impressive, but is really just about helping schools refine their curricula and find ways to stretch limited budgets while nurturing the big dreams of students. It's not a glamorous role, but it makes me feel like I'm contributing something positive, something worthwhile. Perhaps that's why I refuse to join the empire my father and brother manage. Marshall Global, a name that feels so impersonal, even though it used to be Whitaker Innovations, my grandfather Arthur Whitaker's company. I'm not one to linger on history, but if I don't share it with you, you won't grasp why my heart always feels gripped by an unnamed pressure. Seattle, this city of evergreen-lined streets and vibrant music scenes, was once the place where I grew up in the warm embrace of my mother and the firm guidance of my grandfather. But now, it's just a reflection of the fractures in my family. Fractures I've tried to repair so many times, but never could. Let me tell you about my family, about the people who shaped my life, and about the secret that's simmering, waiting for the day it ignites. Seattle in 2025 is no longer the quaint tech haven I once knew. It's become a bustling innovation center with towering skyscrapers and roads constantly jammed with electric vehicles. In the heart of downtown, the headquarters of Marshall Global, formerly Whitaker Innovations, rises high like a monument to authority. That structure with its sleek silver glass and the stark etched M emblem was once my grandfather Arthur Whitaker's greatest achievement. He built Whitaker Innovations from scratch, transforming it into a pillar of integrity and eco-friendliness. The company specialized in infrastructure and renewable energy, from advanced wind turbines to water conservation initiatives for drought-prone areas. My grandfather always said, "Earning money isn't difficult, but earning money while preserving your principles is the true test." I remember when I was a kid, he'd take me and my brother Garrett through the company's gleaming corridors. He'd point at the images on the walls, projects in developing regions, wind farms in Wyoming, and explain the duties of a business leader. "You boys must remember," he'd say, his voice deep and steady as rock. "Money is a means, not an end." I, just a 9-year-old boy, would nod enthusiastically, even if I didn't fully comprehend. But Garrett, my older brother, would just offer a subtle grin, his eyes already sparkling with the drive I'd only identify years later. In 2021, everything shifted. My grandfather vanished. He was on a fishing trip in Montana, a spot he'd often visit to connect with the wilderness. As he used to say, he didn't return. The authorities were alerted. Drones scanned the forests, and search parties combed every trail. But there was no sign, no remains, no hints. Just the leather hat he always wore discovered near a quiet river. They ruled him deceased, maybe mauled by wildlife or lost in a gorge. I never accepted it. Arthur Whitaker wasn't the sort of man who simply disappeared. He was a man of order, of strategies, of meticulously planned moves. But I was the only one in the family who rejected that narrative. And because of that, I became the outsider. I'm not the type who belongs at champagne-filled galas or executive sessions. I prefer serene mornings reading in my modest apartment or sitting with my mother, hearing her tales about her younger days when she and my grandfather planted the first pine trees in our family yard. I studied education at the University of Washington, graduated with distinction. But instead of entering Whitaker Innovations as my father and brother anticipated, I forged my own direction. My father, Charles Marshall, called it disloyalty. My brother, Garrett, called it foolishness. You're a fool, Daniel. You've got a kingdom at your fingertips, and you choose to chase the visions of idealists. I don't fault them. My father and Garrett have their motivations for viewing it that way. Whitaker Innovations, or Marshall Global now, is a profit engine. But I started noticing the blemishes. Questionable ventures infiltrating the company after my grandfather's vanishing. Dubious agreements with officials. Facilities violating ecological regulations. Funds from obscure origins. I once clashed with my father during a family meal when he boasted about a mining operation in Nevada. Dad, Grandpa would never have approved this, I said, my voice shaking with frustration. He just stared at me, his eyes hard as iron. Arthur's gone. Daniel, this is my era. I left the house that night with a bag of clothes and a burdened soul. Since then, I've lived independently, only sporadically visiting my mother. The only person in the family who still connects me to what I once called home. My father, Charles Marshall, whose real name is Carlos Marino, is a man riddled with paradoxes. He came from Colombia, migrating to the U.S. as a young man with aspirations for a brighter future and a keen intellect. My grandfather Arthur recognized his potential when he was just a junior engineer on a minor Whitaker Innovations project. Grandpa guided him, provided chances to advance, and eventually blessed his marriage to my mother, Clara Whitaker, despite the resistance from the entire Whitaker family. Carlos is a man of tomorrow, Grandpa once declared. He's got passion in his gaze. My father didn't disappoint Grandpa, at least in the initial years. He labored tirelessly, turning Grandpa's concepts into tangible successes. But when my mother gave birth to me and Garrett, something in him altered. I still recall the expression in his eyes when Grandpa announced his retirement intentions, planning to pass control to an impartial board rather than one individual. My father said nothing, but his hand clenched his wine glass so firmly I thought it would break. After Grandpa vanished, my father swiftly assumed command. He rebranded the company Marshall Global, wiping away Grandpa's heritage. The images of projects in remote areas vanished from the corridors. The principles Grandpa had established, integrity, sustainability, were supplanted by new terms: revenue, growth, dominance. I look at my father and wonder where the man who knelt to propose to my mother, who cradled me and Garrett in his arms, has disappeared to. Now, about my mother, to describe her, I envision a delicate crystal blossom, elegant but vulnerable, though she'd never confess it. Clara Whitaker Marshall, the only daughter of Arthur Whitaker, grew up under her father's sheltering influence. She's compassionate, cherishes the outdoors, and has a spirit so vast it seems out of place in this world. When she wed my father, many in the Whitaker family protested, labeling him an ambitious newcomer, but she ignored them. Love doesn't require credentials. She once told me when I was a child and inquired why she selected him. But after Grandpa vanished, she transformed. She became withdrawn, her eyes always shaded with sorrow. She spoke less, smiled less, and her well-being started to decline. I know she misses Grandpa, her father, who was not just the family's foundation, but her dearest advisor. Every time I visit, she sits by the window gazing at the now faded garden and shares stories about him. Daniel, your grandfather was an extraordinary man, she says, her voice quivering. He'd never forsake us. I want to trust her, but 4 years is a long stretch. Still, every time I meet her gaze, I see a subtle glimmer of optimism, as if she knows something I don't. Garrett, my brother, is 3 years older than me, but the divide between us feels like an era. Garrett is a replica of our father, driven, detached, and always skilled at swaying others to his agenda. When we were children, we were inseparable. He taught me how to knot a tie, pitch a baseball, and rise after a stumble. But as we matured, Garrett evolved. He began regarding me with contempt, as if I were feeble, unworthy of the martial name. Garrett joined Whitaker Innovations immediately after university. He rapidly became our father's key ally. And when Grandpa vanished, he was the first to endorse the rebranding. Whitaker is history, he stated at a family gathering, his tone sharp as a blade. Marshall is tomorrow. I tried to object, but he just smirked. Daniel, you don't grasp how the world operates. Garrett doesn't merely desire influence. He yearns for acclaim, to tower above all. I know he's gearing up for a major step, an international IPO for Marshall Global that will propel him and our father to the pinnacle of the economic elite. But every time I meet his eyes, I see a void where familial affection once resided. And then there's the man I respect most, my grandfather, Arthur Whitaker. He was a figure all of Seattle admired. At 70, he was still imposing, with silver hair and eyes keen as a falcon's. He wasn't just the creator of Whitaker Innovations. He was an emblem of honesty. He rejected numerous profitable deals because they clashed with his ethics. Money can purchase much, he'd say, but it can't secure a peaceful rest. The day he vanished, my world shattered. I remember that morning when my father received the call from the search team. He slumped into a chair, his face ashen, but I saw no tears. Garrett was occupied on the phone with attorneys and the directors. Only my mother wept, sobbing so intensely I had to hold her firmly to prevent her from falling. The authorities searched for weeks but uncovered nothing. The headlines screamed, "Whitaker Innovations founder mysteriously vanishes." Then they pronounced him dead. But I don't accept it. I can't. In the nights following his vanishing, I'd dream of him injured, calling for aid. I'd rush toward him. But the nearer I approached, the farther he appeared. I'd awaken drenched in sweat, my heart racing. I've questioned myself endlessly. Is he truly gone? And if he's alive, where is he? Why hasn't he returned? These queries torment me daily, and I can't uncover the answers. My family, or rather, what remains of it, disintegrated the day my grandfather vanished. My father and Garrett capitalized on the chance to reshape Whitaker Innovations into Marshall Global, as if they aimed to obliterate every vestige of him. My mother, Clara, plunged deeper into her mourning while I became an exile, sidelined by the very individuals I cherished most. But I couldn't merely observe. I couldn't allow everything to descend into obscurity. In the months after my grandfather's vanishing, I began to realize that my father and Garrett didn't just want to manage the company. They wanted to possess it utterly and completely. I still recall the initial shareholders' assembly I attended just weeks after the search for my grandfather was halted. I went there expecting to hear a transparent strategy, a pledge that the company would uphold his vision. Instead, I witnessed a meticulously orchestrated spectacle. My father stood at the lectern, attired in a sharp black suit, his voice resonant and authoritative. "Whitaker Innovations has embarked on a fresh chapter," he proclaimed, his eyes scanning the assembly of shareholders like a monarch addressing his court. "We will broaden our reach. We will expand worldwide. And to achieve that, we require a new identity, Marshall Global. The room burst into cheers. I sat in the rear, gripping my hands so tightly that my nails bit into my skin. Garrett stood beside my father, wearing a self-satisfied grin, as if this was the instant he'd anticipated his whole life. I wanted to rise, to declare that they were betraying my grandfather, betraying the foundations this company was erected upon. But I couldn't. I just remained there, helpless, observing my father and brother erase my grandfather's heritage with a new title. After the assembly, Garrett approached me, still with that subtle grin. "Daniel, you're behind the times," he said, his tone laced with derision. "This isn't a venue for visionaries." I didn't reply. I just rose and departed, carrying a searing rage in my chest. On the drive home, I reflected on my grandfather, on his piercing eyes and warm, reliable voice. He would never have permitted this. But he wasn't present anymore. Marshall Global didn't take long to expose its genuine nature. Just a few months later, I started hearing whispers about the company's emerging initiatives my grandfather would have deemed offenses. A chemical facility in Oregon releasing untreated pollutants directly into the waterways. A timber harvesting contract in the Pacific Northwest, despite the company's prior pledges to conservation. And then a mining project in Nevada, the one my father proudly touted at a family supper, as if it were his crowning triumph. I couldn't remain quiet. That evening at the expansive family residence in the Seattle outskirts, I confronted my father. My mother sat at the table's end, silently stirring her chilled soup. Garrett sipped his wine, his eyes locked on me as if anticipating my actions. "Dad, Grandpa would never have sanctioned the Nevada project," I said, striving to keep my tone steady. "It contradicts everything Whitaker Innovations represented." My father set down his wine glass and regarded me with frosty eyes. "Arthur's not here anymore. I'm steering the company now, and I know how to generate wealth. Generate wealth by ravaging the environment, by aligning with dishonest leaders." I couldn't restrain myself anymore. "Do you even comprehend the repercussions of those agreements?" Garrett emitted a harsh chuckle. "Daniel, you're such a simpleton. The world doesn't function on your noble principles. Wealth rules, and we're doing what's essential to maintain this company at the summit." My mother looked up, her eyes misty with tears. "Daniel, stop," she whispered. "Just let it be." But I couldn't. "Mom, I can't allow them to demolish Grandpa's heritage. I can't just stand idle." My father pounded the table, causing the plates to clatter. "Enough. Daniel, if you don't wish to be part of this family, then leave. I don't need a son who's perpetually dwelling in some ethical illusion." I stood, my heart feeling pulverized. My mother reached for me, but I shook my head. "I'm sorry, Mom. I can't remain." I drove back to my apartment, tears cascading down my face. I wasn't weeping because of my father's words, but because I felt like I'd forfeited everything. My family, my grandfather, and the conviction that things would ever mend. In the years that ensued, I existed like a phantom. I worked, socialized with friends, but there was always a hollowness within me that I couldn't satisfy. I seldom went home, only occasionally seeing my mother, who grew more delicate with each passing day. Every time I saw her, I could sense her anguish, the anguish of a woman who had lost her father and been deserted by her husband and eldest son in her own residence. One time when I visited, she took my hand, her fingers cold and shaking. "Daniel, do you ever wonder if your grandfather might still be alive?" she asked, her voice as soft as a fleeting wind. I stiffened. Mom, what are you implying? She gazed out at the withered garden, her eyes far away. Arthur was a resilient man. He couldn't just evaporate like that. Something's amiss. Daniel, I sense it. I squeezed her hand, my heart thumping. I think so, too, Mom, but I don't know what to do. No one believes me. She turned to me, a rare flicker of hope in her eyes. You're my anchor, Daniel. You have to uncover the truth. Her words kindled a modest flame inside me. I started delving into old details about my grandfather's vanishing. I reread news reports, police files, and the records I'd preserved from 4 years ago. Everything led to one inference: no body, no solid proof, just his leather hat discovered too conveniently by the river, as if someone intended it to be found. I began to harbor doubts, but doubts alone weren't sufficient. I needed evidence, and I didn't know where to begin. While I was adrift in unresolved queries, Marshall Global continued to flourish. My father and Garrett featured in the news, lauded as innovative pioneers. But I knew the reality. I heard rumors from my grandfather's former associates, people who had been dismissed or compelled to retire. They spoke of vast sums shifted abroad, pacts inked in secrecy, and dubious ties with influential figures. I attempted to contact a few, but most declined to speak. Daniel, you don't comprehend, one of my grandfather's old companions murmured over the phone. This company isn't Arthur's anymore. You need to tread carefully. Carefully. I wasn't frightened, but I was isolated. Every time I tried to converse with Garrett, he'd just smirk and label me delusional. One time, in a rare instance when he consented to meet me at a coffee shop in downtown Seattle, I asked him outright, Garrett, do you know anything about Grandpa? Is there something you're concealing from me? He regarded me, his eyes frigid as frost. Daniel, you need to mature. He's gone. It occurs, people perish, and the world continues turning. If you want to linger in the past eternally, proceed. But don't pull me and Dad down with you. I left that coffee shop feeling like I'd been pierced in the core. Garrett wasn't just my brother. He used to be my closest companion, but now he viewed me as an adversary. Then, on a late September evening, everything transformed. I was sitting in my apartment, the glow from the desk lamp illuminating the stack of documents before me. Outside, a soft rain tapped against the window, smudging the glass pane. The doorbell rang, abrupt and piercing, startling me. I checked the clock, nearly 11 p.m. Who would visit at this hour? I wasn't anticipating anyone, and my friends knew I disliked interruptions at night. I rose, my heart inexplicably racing. I approached the door and peered through the peephole. A man stood there, his head shrouded by a hood, his features hidden in darkness. I hesitated, my hand on the knob, but then I opened the door, even though part of me wanted to retreat and pretend I hadn't heard. The man lifted his head, and as the corridor light illuminated his face, I felt my blood chill. Silver-white hair, falcon-like eyes, though now dimmed by years and hardship. It was my grandfather, Arthur Whitaker. Daniel, he said, his voice low and raspy, as if he hadn't spoken in ages. Can you let me in? I stood immobilized, unable to trust my sight. Grandpa, I stammered, feeling the floor shift beneath me. You're alive. He smiled, a weary but affectionate smile. Let's go inside. Daniel, we have much to discuss. I guided him into the apartment, still dazed. My grandfather settled into the old armchair, removing his hood to reveal a thin face marked with fresh lines. He wore a tattered wool coat, no longer the refined man in a suit I recalled from Whitaker Innovations. But his eyes, those eyes, were still piercing, still brimming with determination, as if nothing could shatter him. I prepared a mug of hot coffee and set it before him, my hands shaking so much that I spilled a bit on the table. "Grandpa, where have you been for the past 4 years?" I asked, my voice faltering. "Everyone said you were dead. I tried to search for you, but—" He raised a hand, gesturing for me to pause. "Daniel, I know you never surrendered. That's why I'm here tonight." He drew a deep breath, as if bracing to recount a tale he'd buried for too long. "But first, you need to promise me one thing. What I'm about to reveal, you can't share with anyone." I nodded, though my heart hammered. "I promise, Grandpa, tell me." And so he commenced. 4 years ago, during that fishing trip in Montana, everything had been contrived. He hadn't gone solo as the reports claimed. Charles, my father, and Garrett had accompanied him. "They said it would be a family outing," he said, his voice tinged with bitterness. But I had my reservations. Charles had shifted long before then. His ambition exceeded what I'd ever envisioned. He described how, in the chilly woods, my father and Garrett guided him to a secluded river. They claimed they wanted to pause and relax. But then, in an unforeseen instant, they shoved him into a chasm. I fell, Daniel, I fell hard. But I didn't perish. A rancher living nearby discovered me, brought me to his lodge, and cared for my injuries. I sat there, clutching the table's edge, feeling the world invert. "Dad and Garrett," I whispered. "They tried to kill you." My grandfather nodded, his eyes shadowing. "They believed I was dead. They needed me eliminated to gain absolute control. Charles always coveted this company. Daniel, he didn't just want to lead it. He wanted to possess it, to expunge my name from Whitaker Innovations' heritage." My throat constricted, tears rising. "But why didn't you return immediately? Why did you let us believe you were dead?" He placed a hand on my shoulder, his hold slender but firm. "I needed time, Daniel. Time to amass proof. Time to ensure that when I reemerge, Charles and Garrett couldn't refute it. I've spent 4 years in concealment, connecting with old allies, people still faithful to me. I have tapes, messages, files all confirming their scheme." I wept, not from sorrow, but from rage, agony, and a subtle spark of hope kindling within me. My grandfather was alive. He was here before me, and he needed me. "What do you want me to do?" I asked, wiping my tears with my sleeve. "I'll do anything to rectify this." He regarded me, his eyes brightening faintly. "Daniel, you're the only one I trust. You haven't been corrupted by authority. You have your mother's compassion and my tenacity. I want you to assist me in revealing the truth. But it won't be simple. Charles and Garrett have clout, resources, and they'll do anything to safeguard what they've constructed." I nodded, though a tempest of feelings churned inside me. "I'll do it. Grandpa, I'll help you." He smiled for the first time that night, and I saw the man I'd always revered, the one who taught me about truthfulness, accountability, and defending what's just. "Good," he said, "but we must be cautious. Charles isn't naive, and Garrett is even more perilous. They can't know I'm back, not until we're prepared." A few days later, my grandfather led me to a modest house on the fringes of Seattle where he was concealed. It was a simple wooden cottage nestled behind ancient pines, distant from the city's clamor. He said he'd leased it through a go-between to evade notice. I still couldn't fathom he was here, alive and breathing, after 4 years of assuming he was lost forever. "Daniel, there's one more person who needs to know the truth," he said, his voice dropping. "Your mother," I paused. "But you said not to tell anyone." He nodded. "I did. But Clara is my daughter. She deserves to know, and I'm concerned about her health. She needs something to bolster her spirit to endure." I concurred, though I remained uneasy. My mother was so vulnerable, both bodily and emotionally. Would the revelation that my grandfather was alive surpass the anguish of the truth about my father and Garrett? I phoned my mother, telling her I wanted her to come to my apartment to converse. When she arrived, I gently explained that I had a unique surprise and needed her to accompany me. She looked at me, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but she agreed. I drove her to the cottage, speaking little en route. She sat beside me, her hands clasped firmly, her stare distant. When we entered the cottage, my grandfather was waiting in the living area. My mother saw him, and time seemed to halt. She froze, her lips quivering, then erupted into tears. "Dad, Dad," she whispered, hurrying into his embrace. My grandfather held her closely, tears tracing his weathered cheeks. "Clara, my daughter, I'm sorry for making you wait so long." I stood there observing them, feeling my heart fracture with both delight and sorrow. My mother sobbed, as if all the grief of the past 4 years was gushing forth. He told her everything: the fishing trip, the plot by my father and Garrett, and the years he'd spent in seclusion. My mother listened, her expression moving from astonishment to hurt, and finally to indignation. "Charles," she whispered, her voice shaking with rage, "he did this to you." My grandfather took her hand. "Clara, I know this is difficult to accept, but I need you to be resilient. We're going to reclaim what belongs to this family, and Daniel will aid us." My mother turned to me, her eyes igniting with a resolve I hadn't seen in years. "Daniel, you're my hope. You have to do this." I nodded, sensing a fresh burden settle on my shoulders. This wasn't just my grandfather's battle. It was mine, my mother's, and the heritage my grandfather had forged. In the days that followed, my grandfather and I began to strategize. He showed me the proof he'd assembled over the past 4 years: messages between my father and Garrett, recordings of their discussions, and files demonstrating the unlawful shift of Whitaker Innovations' resources. Each item of evidence was like a dagger to the heart. I was raised in my father's embrace, once admiring his cleverness and resolve. But now I saw only a betrayer. My grandfather reached out to a legal group he trusted, longtime associates from his tenure leading the company. They assisted us in confirming his legal status, ensuring that when he resurfaced, no one could dispute he was Arthur Whitaker. They also drafted papers to litigate against my father and Garrett, charging them with attempted homicide, misappropriation, and ruining the company's heritage. Meanwhile, I covertly met with my mother every week, ensuring she was coping and not betraying any indications of my grandfather's return. She began eating better, and her eyes slowly regained their luster. "Daniel, I've never felt so vital," she said during one visit. "Your grandfather is back, and I believe you'll do what's right." But I couldn't deny the mounting fear in my heart. My father and Garrett were not to be taken lightly. They had wealth, influence, and individuals ready to do anything to shield them. If I faltered, Not only would my grandfather and mother be at risk, but I could lose all. One evening, as my grandfather and I examined the documents, he abruptly paused and looked at me gravely. "Daniel, I've revised my will," he said. "I've nullified all prior directives, all the holdings, equities, and oversight of the company. I'm bequeathing them to you." I was astounded. "Grandpa, I'm not certain I can," he interrupted. "You can. Daniel, you're the only one I trust. You'll guide Whitaker Innovations back to its proper course. I have faith in you." I didn't know what to say. The obligation was vast, daunting. But gazing into his eyes, I knew I couldn't decline. This wasn't solely about the company. It was about fairness, about kin, about correcting the injustices of yesteryear. As I departed the cottage that night, the rain had ceased, leaving a sky brimming with sparkling stars. I stood on the veranda, inhaling the crisp air, feeling a novel vigor surging through me. My grandfather was back, and he had selected me. I was no longer the family's pariah. I was the one who would rise, confront my father and Garrett, and illuminate the truth. But I knew the true conflict lay ahead, and it wouldn't be straightforward. 2 weeks later, a cream envelope arrived at my apartment. I retrieved it from the doormat, surprised to see the words Marshall Global imprinted on the stationery. Inside was an invitation with elegant lines in silver script. "You are cordially invited, Daniel Marshall, to attend the family reunion commemorating the 4th anniversary of the triumphant shift from Whitaker Innovations to Marshall Global. Time 8:00 p.m. October 20th. Location Marshall Global Headquarters, Seattle, Washington." I held the invitation, feeling as if it scorched my palm. A family reunion. Since when did my father and Garrett concern themselves with including me for 4 years? They had excluded me from all, treating me like a stranger. Why were they extending this now I called my mother, the only family member I still relied on, to inquire if she knew about this? Daniel, I received an invitation too," she said over the phone, her voice weak but laced with resolve. "I'm attending, and you should as well. This is our opportunity to accomplish what must be done." I grasped her meaning. She knew the truth about my grandfather, about my father and Garrett's conspiracy, and she wanted me to bring him to this gathering, not merely for a reunion, but to unveil everything. I visited my grandfather that same evening in the wooden cottage on the town's edge. He was seated in an armchair, holding a mug of coffee, his eyes illuminating when I informed him about the invitation. "This is our juncture, Daniel," he said, his voice soft and steadfast. "Charles and Garrett believe they've triumphed. They want to parade their success before the press, the investors. But they don't know I'm back, and we're going to make them accountable." I nodded, my heart throbbing. "But Grandpa, what if they suspect something? What if they discover you before we're set?" He placed a hand on my shoulder, his stare penetrating. "Daniel, I endured 4 years in obscurity. I know how to guard a secret, and you're the one who will stand beside me. We have the proof, the facts, and Clara. We'll do this." In the days preceding the event, my grandfather and I labored relentlessly. We convened with the legal team he had engaged, a cadre of experienced attorneys who had collaborated with him during Whitaker Innovations' prime. They helped us arrange the evidence tapes of my father and Garrett plotting to remove my grandfather, messages outlining illicit dealings, and charts illustrating how they had wrongfully transferred company equities. Each fragment of proof was like a projectile primed for the opportune moment. I also met with my mother in secrecy several times to confirm she was sturdy enough to confront what approached. She had altered since reuniting with my grandfather. She was no longer the delicate, silent woman I'd known. A modest blaze burned in her eyes, though I knew she was still wounded by the notion of my father's treachery. "Daniel, I'm not sure I want to proceed," she said during one meeting at my apartment, her hands gripped tightly. "But I must for your grandfather, for you and for myself." I embraced her, sensing the fragile yet fierce determination within. "Mom, I'll be with you. Grandpa will be too. We'll navigate this together." On the evening of October 20th, I stood before the mirror in my apartment, donning a charcoal gray suit I seldom wore. I gazed at myself, scarcely recognizing the man with stern eyes and rigid shoulders. I was no longer Daniel Marshall, the education consultant leading a tranquil existence. I was Daniel Marshall, the man who would enter the predator's lair, equipped with the truth to topple those who had deceived my family. I drove to Marshall Global's headquarters, my heart pounding. The glass edifice shimmered under the illumination, the massive M emblem gleaming like a proclamation of might. Inside, the principal hall had been converted into an opulent banquet space with elongated tables covered in ivory linen, glistening champagne flutes, and gentle jazz melodies from a live ensemble. Investors, associates, and journalists mingled, chuckling and toasting. The atmosphere was dense with complacency, as if everyone thought Marshall Global was indestructible. I entered, sensing inquisitive and scornful looks directed at me. A few whispered as I passed, "That's Daniel, Charles's younger son. I heard he doesn't work for the company." The misfit of the Marshall family. I disregarded them, scanning the crowd for my mother. She stood in a nook, clad in a long sapphire blue gown, her eyes brightening when she spotted me. I approached, grasped her hand, and murmured, "Mom, Grandpa's prepared." She nodded, her lips compressed. "So am I, Daniel." The occasion commenced with my father's address. He stood at the lectern, dressed in a polished black suit, his voice booming through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, a self-assured smile on his lips. "Today signifies a pivotal landmark. 4 years ago, we transitioned from Whitaker Innovations to Marshall Global, and today, we stand as one of the globe's premier conglomerates. This is the accomplishment of the Marshall family, of me, of my son Garrett, and of all of you." The room exploded in applause. I stood in the nook, clenching my fists. "The Marshall family," he said, as if my mother and I were non-existent, as if my grandfather hadn't established the groundwork for all they possessed. Garrett ascended the lectern next, continuing from my father. He appeared flawless in a navy suit, his hair neatly combed, his voice silky like a statesman's. "Marshall Global is poised to enter a new phase," he announced. "We are readying for a worldwide IPO, elevating our company to international exchanges. This is the instant to cement our standing, not just in America, but globally." Another surge of applause, my stomach twisted. I glanced at my mother, seeing her clutch her champagne flute tightly, her eyes restraining a tempest. I knew the moment had arrived. I exited the room, feigning a trip to the restroom, but actually, I went to rendezvous with my grandfather. He was waiting in a discreet corridor behind the building, attired in a deep blue suit, supported by a walking stick, his white hair tidily arranged. Despite his years, he radiated an undeniable aura, the aura of Arthur Whitaker. the originator of Whitaker Innovations. "Are you ready, Daniel?" he inquired, his eyes acute. I inhaled deeply. "I'm ready, Grandpa." We proceeded into the room, and instantly the ambiance changed. Murmurs spread through the assembly. Eyes pivoting toward us, I led the path, forging a route for my grandfather. He advanced slowly, but each stride was like an assertion. When we reached the room's center, my father and Garrett were still at the lectern, their expressions shifting from arrogance to astonishment. "Ladies and gentlemen," I declared loudly, my voice quaking with feeling but distinct, "I'd like to present someone we all believed was lost forever, Mr. Arthur Whitaker, the founder of Whitaker Innovations." The room hushed, some mouths agape, others rising in disbelief. My grandfather ascended the lectern, leaning on his walking stick, but his stance as erect as a pine. "I am Arthur Whitaker," he stated, his voice echoing through the space. "And I am not deceased. 4 years ago, I was betrayed by those I trusted most. Charles Marshall and Garrett Marshall orchestrated an incident to remove me, to capture this company." Whispers surged like tides. I looked at my father, seeing him strive to preserve his poise, but his lips were taut, and I knew he was unraveling. Garrett advanced, his tone biting. "What is this farce? That man cannot be Arthur Whitaker. He's deceased." My grandfather smiled, a chilly smile. "Charles, Garrett, did you think I wouldn't return? Did you think you could erase my name, pilfer my heritage, and exist in tranquility?" He gestured to me. I stepped forward, bearing a compact projector the legal team had readied. A large display descended, and I began exhibiting the evidence we had compiled. First came the tape, my father and Garrett's voices unmistakable, debating thrusting my grandfather into the chasm. "He won't endure," my father's voice resounded, cold and merciless. "We'll claim it was a mishap." The room silenced. Some investors covered their mouths, eyes widened in dread. I proceeded, showing messages between my father and a regional official discussing the wrongful transfer of Whitaker Innovations equities. Finally, I displayed the resource chart revealing millions diverted overseas via phantom entities. My mother rose from her seat, her face streaked with tears, but her voice robust. "Charles, what have you inflicted on my father?" She advanced to the lectern, confronting my father. "You tried to murder my father. You betrayed me, betrayed this family." My father retreated, his face pallid. "Clara, you don't understand. This is a misinterpretation." "A misinterpretation." My mother's voice cracked with fury. "My father and I always supported you, backed you in every way when you first arrived in America. And you attempted to assassinate my father. You're a predator disguised as kin. Ungrateful." Garrett attempted to interrupt, his voice wavering. "Everyone, this is a plot. That man is not Arthur Whitaker. He's a fraud." But my grandfather was equipped. He presented identification papers authenticated by the legal team and a brief recording from the rancher in Montana who had rescued him 4 years ago. "I am Arthur Whitaker," he affirmed again, his voice like thunder. "And I've returned to reclaim what is mine, to my family, to Whitaker Innovations." The room erupted in whispers like a wave crashing after being restrained too long. Some investors stood, their voices escalating in outrage, calling for an instant inquiry. Journalists swarmed like scavengers, flashes erupting, capturing every instant. But then the clamor ceased suddenly as the main doors swung open and a squad of uniformed law enforcement entered, weapons secured, their stern gazes surveying the gathering. I stood frozen, my heart pounding. They had arrived sooner than anticipated. My grandfather's legal team had been discreetly collaborating with the FBI in the preceding days. And now the moment of reckoning had come. A tall, grave-faced police captain ascended the lectern, lifting a hand for quiet. "Charles Marshall, Garrett Marshall," he declared, his voice resounding like a judgment. "You are under arrest for charges of conspiracy to commit homicide, misappropriation, and monetary deception." The room fell mute. I looked at my father, seeing him step back, his face ashen, his hands shaking. Garrett attempted to flee toward a side exit, but two officers obstructed him, seizing his arms. The snap of restraints echoed, sharp like a knife slicing the air. My father tried to uphold his composure, but as the cuffs tightened, I saw a flash of alarm in his eyes, something I'd never witnessed in the man who was always so assured. "You're erring!" Garrett shouted, his voice fracturing with wrath and terror. "This is a scheme. That man is not Arthur Whitaker." But no one heeded. The investors observed in shock, some shielding their mouths, eyes wide with horror. My mother stood in the corner, grasping her gown, tears flowing down her face. I wanted to rush to her, to assure her all would be well, but I couldn't stir. I remained there, watching my father and Garrett being escorted from the room amid the blinding flashes and the crowd's murmurs. As the doors shut behind them, a profound silence enveloped the space. A keen ache pierced my chest. This was my father, the man who taught me to lace my shoes when I was 5. This was Garrett, the brother who hoisted me on his shoulders through autumn meadows. Now they were being led away like offenders, and I didn't know how to feel enraged, devastated, or eased. My grandfather lifted a hand, calling for quiet. The room stilled, all eyes on him. His voice rang out, firm and immovable like a peak that could not be swayed. "Today, we have beheld the truth, but the truth is not merely for revealing, it's for reconstructing. I have composed a new will. All my authority, equities, and holdings will be conveyed to my grandson, Daniel Marshall. He is the only one in this family who has not been obscured by dominance. He will guide Whitaker Innovations back to its rightful trajectory." I felt my blood freeze. Every eye in the room turned to me curious, doubtful, and a few brimming with optimism. I wanted to speak, to object, to say I wasn't deserving, that I wasn't prepared, but my throat constricted as if seized by an unseen force. I wasn't the man my grandfather portrayed, the robust, resolute leader ready to assume an empire. I was just Daniel, the education consultant who favored quiet dawns and vintage tomes. The burden he'd placed on me felt like a summit, and I wasn't sure I could bear it. I looked at my mother. Her eyes gleamed with a determination I hadn't seen in years. She nodded at me, as if affirming her belief in me. I looked at my grandfather, seeing his keen but trusting gaze, and in that instant, I knew I couldn't retreat. Not because I craved authority, but because I sought justice for my grandfather, for my mother, and for myself. I ascended the lectern, my legs heavy but steadfast. I drew a deep breath, attempting to calm the whirlwind of emotions within. "I don't vow to be flawless," I said, my voice quivering but audible, resonating through the space. "But I vow to do all I can to restore Whitaker Innovations to what my grandfather created: a company of honor, duty, and a brighter tomorrow." The room was quiet for a beat. Then a few began to applaud. The ovation expanded, swelling into a resounding acclaim. I looked at my mother, seeing her smile amid her tears. I looked at my grandfather, seeing him nod, his eyes radiating pride. And in that moment, I knew that regardless of the challenges ahead, I wouldn't traverse them alone. The following morning, Seattle was rattled profoundly. Prominent publications from the New York Times to the Seattle Times splashed headlines blaring Whitaker Innovations founder returns from the grave, accuses son-in-law and grandson of assassination scheme. Photos of my grandfather standing resolute at the lectern with a steely stare inundated social platforms. Clips from the family reunion proliferated rapidly, paired with the eerie audio of my father and Garrett dispassionately plotting his elimination. The world was ignited, and Marshall Global, the name my father and Garrett had so arrogantly erected, was now the epicenter of a staggering controversy. The FBI moved promptly. Mere hours after the gathering, my grandfather's legal team submitted all the evidence to the officials. Federal operatives stormed Marshall Global's headquarters, barricading offices and confiscating devices and records. My father and Garrett's personal holdings from their estate in the Seattle suburbs to their foreign accounts were immobilized. I learned from an old acquaintance at the company that my father had attempted to contact his attorney, but no one would accept the case. "They know Charles and Garrett have no chance," my acquaintance said, his voice shaded with sorrow. "The proof is too evident." Daniel. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me desired retribution, wanted my father and Garrett to atone for their deeds. But another part, the son, the sibling, ached at the image of them restrained, paraded before the world. I tried to banish those thoughts, but they adhered like persistent shadows. In the weeks that followed, the press morphed my family's saga into a sensational epic. Discussion programs featured analysts to analyze every facet, from the doomed fishing trip in Montana to my grandfather's years in hiding. Some sensational rags even concocted tales claiming he had dwelled in a cavern or become a recluse. I wanted to chuckle at those pieces, but my mirth was acerbic. The reality was agonizing enough without their fabrications. My mother became the focal point. Though she shunned it, journalists besieged her home, attempting to capture images through the panes, seeking to question her about her disloyal spouse. I had to employ guards to repel them, protecting her from the unyielding media barrage. My grandfather, conversely, managed the scrutiny with remarkable serenity. He consented to an exclusive dialogue with a respected journal, narrating his account succinctly but with undeniable gravity. "I didn't return for notoriety or control," he stated on broadcast, his eyes locked on the lens. "I returned for equity and for those I cherish." His words were like a spark, kindling aspiration in the souls of those who had once labored for Whitaker Innovations. Many dismissed staff, ousted by my father and Garrett, contacted me, voicing their wish to rejoin. They dubbed me Arthur's successor, though I felt unready for such a designation. The proceedings against my father and Garrett extended for nearly 8 months, but the result was unavoidable. The FBI, bolstered by my grandfather's legal cadre, constructed an impenetrable argument conspiracy to homicide, diversion of millions, laundering through facade firms, and the erosion of Whitaker Innovations' heritage. The trial was avidly tracked by the media, with fresh banners daily: "Son-in-law betrays Arthur Whitaker. Garrett Marshall faces lifetime incarceration." I didn't attend the trial. I couldn't. The notion of sitting there, observing my father and Garrett at the defense bench, hearing them rationalize their offenses, made me feel asphyxiated. But my mother attended, despite my efforts to dissuade her. I need to witness it myself, Daniel, she said. I need to know justice has prevailed. When the decision arrived, she called me, her voice unsteady but composed. Charles was sentenced to 25 years for conspiracy to homicide and misappropriation, she said. Garrett received 18 years for involvement in fiscal deceit. They won't be free anytime soon. Daniel. I collapsed into a chair, clutching the phone. Mom, are you all right? I asked, though I knew the response. She paused, then said, I'm all right, but I need time. I understood. I needed time too. I wasn't elated about their sentencing, but I wasn't as sorrowful as I'd anticipated. Perhaps I'd lost them long before the day they opted to betray my grandfather, to betray our kin. But the ache persisted, like a mark that would never wholly mend. Entrusted by my grandfather, I formally assumed Marshall Global, or rather, reinstated it to its original moniker, Whitaker Innovations. The day I authorized the name reversion, I stood in the company's primary conference room, staring at the impersonal M emblem on the wall. Remove it, I instructed the personnel, my voice more stable than I felt. We're reviving Whitaker Innovations. The reformation wasn't effortless. My father and Garrett had left disarray shadowy pacts, ecologically harmful ventures, and a staff that had forfeited trust. I toiled ceaselessly with a panel of consultants my grandfather suggested, terminating initiatives that misaligned with the company's ethos. We withdrew from the Nevada mining project, recommitted to renewable energy, and pledged transparent operations. I reinstated former staff loyal to my grandfather, heeding their suggestions on redirecting the company. But the toughest aspect wasn't the labor. It was the inner strain. Every day, I grappled with whether I was capable of upholding my grandfather's heritage. Some nights, I sat solitary in my office, gazing at an aged photo of him on the wall, questioning, Grandpa, am I handling this correctly? Once, immersed in those reflections, my mother visited the office. She placed a hand on my shoulder, her look tender but resolute. Daniel, you don't have to be impeccable, she said. You just have to be sincere, like your grandfather. That's all Whitaker Innovations requires. Her words were like a refreshing gust, alleviating some of my uncertainties. I began to trust I could succeed not because I was outstanding, but because I had my mother and grandfather beside me, and because I embraced the values my grandfather had imparted. During a directorate session, I proposed a concept I'd nurtured for ages, a nonprofit endowment named after my mother, the Clara Initiative. It would assist women who had been misled and wounded in unions, offering guidance, monetary support, and chances to reconstruct their lives. I thought of my mother, of the years she dwelled in the shadow of deceit, and I wanted to ensure no one else endured her ordeal. When I presented the notion, some investors were dubious. Daniel, we've just endured a turmoil, one remarked. Is this truly the moment to fund a benevolent endeavor? I met his eyes, my voice calm but firm. Whitaker Innovations isn't solely about gains. It's about individuals. And if we don't aid those in need, we're no better than Marshall Global. The room hushed. Then one person applauded. Then another. Ultimately, the whole board consented. The Clara Initiative was established. And when my mother learned, she embraced me firmly, tears cascading. Daniel, you've made me proud, she said. This is what I've always desired, something positive amid all this suffering. One autumn afternoon, I drove my mother to Montana, where my grandfather had chosen to pass his remaining days. He didn't resume leading Whitaker Innovations, despite my pleas. "Daniel, I've fulfilled my role," he said kindly. "Now it's your era. I just want to live tranquilly in the place that preserved me." His dwelling was in a modest valley encircled by rugged peaks, a basic log cabin with smoke curling from the flue and a small plot he cultivated himself. When we arrived, he was on the porch, perusing an antique volume, his eyes illuminating when he saw my mother. "Clara!" he called, rising to hug her. I stood observing. My heart warmed. My mother chose to remain with him, at least temporarily, to mend the scars in her spirit. As I drove from the valley, I glanced in the rearview mirror, seeing my mother and grandfather side by side, their silhouettes diminishing under the twilight. I knew they would be fine, and so would I. Whitaker Innovations began to thrive anew. Our renewable energy ventures drew fresh backers, attracted by my grandfather's resurgence tale and my dedication to principled commerce. The Clara Initiative expanded swiftly, aiding hundreds of women nationwide. Each gratitude note from them reminded me I was on the correct path. I no longer dreamed of my grandfather wounded. Instead, I dreamed of the open fields where Garrett and I played as youths, where my father once laughed heartily and held me near. Those dreams no longer roused me in chills. They reminded me that despite a painful history, I could forge a superior future. I stood in my office at Whitaker Innovations, overlooking Seattle's glittering lights under the evening sky. On my desk was a photo of my grandfather, my mother, and me, captured the day I officially became the company's leader. I was no longer the outcast. I was Daniel Marshall, successor to Arthur Whitaker's heritage, carrier of my mother's aspiration, and resolved to reconstruct from the remnants of yesteryear. The path forward was still extensive, but I wasn't fearful. I had my mother, my grandfather, and myself, a fortified Daniel, prepared to confront any trial. And deep within, I knew justice had been delivered not just for my family, but for all Whitaker Innovations embodied.